Having just moved to a new city, I turned to Craigslist to find someone to share my new apartment with. As soon as I saw his post, I contacted him. His name was James, and we exchanged a few emails and phone calls, and things seemed to be going well. A few days later, we agreed to meet in person to discuss the details. At first, James seemed like a friendly and easygoing guy. He was in his early 30s and kind of reminded me of myself. We talked for a while about our interests and hobbies, and he shared some funny stories about his previous roommates. As we were wrapping up our conversation, James suddenly got very serious. He told me that there was something that he wanted to let me know. I told him to say anything he wanted. He told me that there would be someone else who would live in his room with him as well. I looked at him, confused, and told him that it would be difficult to manage more people here. He told me not to worry and he won't be getting in my way. I got even more confused and told him to tell me clearly. And he laughed and said that he was just kidding and that I would understand. I shrugged and said it was fine, not a big deal. The first few weeks went by. James seemed like a great roommate and we got along well. But then I started noticing strange things around the apartment in the morning. Food would be missing from the fridge and things would be moved around. One night, I was awakened by a strange noise coming from James's room. It sounded like he was talking to himself, but then I realized it was something else, like a low growling sound. I got up quietly, crept to his door, and listened. The growling got louder and more intense. I opened the door slowly, and as I peered inside, I saw James standing in the middle of the room. It was a strange and unsettling sight. I felt like I was seeing something that I wasn't supposed to see and chose to back away and go back to my room. The sounds went on for a few more minutes before they stopped. In the morning, I refrained from mentioning anything to James because I didn't want to embarrass him and I shouldn't really be peeping on him. He seemed to be acting normal anyway, so I brushed it all under the rug and forgot about it. Another few days went by, and I found myself waking up occasionally to footsteps in the hallways or doors opening and closing, and sometimes even James making that same growling type noise. By this time, he had let me know that he did occasionally sleepwalk. So, knowing this, it didn't frighten me, but I still had trouble falling asleep unless I heard him go back to bed. One night, though, I woke up to James's bedroom door closing. Usually, he closes the door softly, but this he slammed it shut. My eyes shot open, and I stared at my door as his footsteps slowly crept over and stopped. I could see his shadow underneath the crack in the door. Then the doorknob slowly turned, and he opened the door softly. James's figure stood in the darkness between the doorway. I was frozen, staring at the creepy roommate. I knew it was him sleepwalking, but it was still a creepy sight. Then he began making those same growling noises. After a moment, he stopped. A second later, his eyes shot open, and suddenly he lunged towards me. But in seconds, he had me pinned down. His eyes were blank and expressionless. He told me to stay still in a monotone voice as if he was still asleep. He held me tightly. I tried to break free, but he was too strong. I felt a deep, intense fear building inside me. And then, just like that, it was over. James released me and slumped off the bed, then walked back to his room, closing his door softly behind him. I quickly got up and locked my bedroom door, then stayed up for the rest of the night. In the morning, I left for work early before James even got up. I dreaded the thought of seeing him at home after work because I knew it would make things awkward. I stayed at my mom's house for the night before I sort of gathered the courage to talk to James about it. When I got home the next day and talked to James, he was fully aware of it and said he is working on fixing it. I still couldn't take it anymore, so I told him it was best if we weren't roommates anymore. And to my surprise, he understood me fully and didn't get mad. So I no longer live with James, but just myself. It is a story about a strange encounter I had while using Craigslist in its initial days. I used to live in a tiny apartment and wanted to upgrade my TV situation. Going through Craigslist, I found this post about a TV that seemed to fit the bill. It wasn't anything fancy, just a big screen, which was perfect for my small place. So, I sent a quick message to the seller, let's call him Joe, to set up a meeting. The next day, I got a response from Joe, and he was way too enthusiastic about the whole thing. He suggested meeting up at his place around 7 p.m. Now, that's not unusual, but the weird part was he sent me an address and went ghost mode after that. I kept on messaging, but he didn't reply. After a day he messaged, and now gave me another address. His tone had changed, and the way he used words was very different now, but I thought this might be my overthinking. So, after work, I drove over to Joe's place, the second address he gave me. It was already getting dark, and the street lights were on, but the light in front of his house was flickering. I parked in his driveway, and when I got out, I noticed the front door was slightly open. It was a bit odd, but I just assumed he was expecting me and left the door open for convenience. I peeked inside but didn't see anyone, so I rang the doorbell. As soon as I did, I heard a loud thud from inside, and then everything went silent. It was seriously eerie. But before I could second guess myself, the door creaked open, revealing a man who was tall and wore a black robe with a hood on his head. I could only see his lips moving as he spoke. He told me to come in. I refused and told him to call Joe. He stood there for a moment and removed his hood. His face was filled with wrinkles, and he looked scary. He kept on staring at me without blinking and told me that he was Joe. I intended to pick the TV up and leave as soon as I could. I mumbled something about the TV. He stepped aside, letting me in. The moment I crossed the door into the house, I knew something was off. He was not the same guy who had messaged me. I remembered seeing Joe in the picture, and this guy in the house was way bigger, way more intense, and his eyes were just unsettling. I quickly checked out the TV in the next room, muttering that it looked good and I'd take it. He didn't say much, just snatched the money from my hand and stuffed it in his pocket. But then, out of nowhere, he grabbed my shoulder and pushed me toward the other room, trying to lock me in. I struck the man with a candlestick on the table and pushed him. He fainted and I ran towards the kitchen to get out of the house from the back door. I ran outside from the back door and towards my car. As I was igniting the car, I saw that same man in a black robe getting out of the front door of the house, and he began running towards me. While starting the engine, the man began hitting his hands on the side windows of my car. He was screaming and saying something that I couldn't hear. He broke one of the windows, and as he raised his arm towards me, the car started and I put it in the gear, driving away as fast as I could. He fell off, and as I looked from the rearview mirror, I saw him lying in the middle of the road with his head raised and screaming while looking at me. I pulled over a bit down the road, still shaking from the encounter. I called the cops and told them what I had encountered, and they let me know they would investigate. I had heard warnings before about using Craigslist, like people getting scammed, robbed, or in worst cases people getting killed. But I was desperate. I needed a new apartment ASAP, and my budget was tight, so I took a chance and started browsing the housing section on Craigslist. I came across a listing for a small apartment in an old building downtown. The rent was cheap, and the location was perfect for my job. I emailed the owner, and he responded quickly. We discussed the time to meet up in the same building. He told me that he would meet me in the same apartment that he posted an ad for. A couple of days later, I drove over there. When I arrived at the apartment building, I couldn't help but feel a bit let down. The old brick facade was crumbling, and the windows were old and dirty, with one of them even boarded up. I climbed the stairs up to the second floor and knocked on the door of that apartment. The man opened the door, and I was surprised by how friendly he was. He showed me around the apartment, which was small but still nice. It was in good condition, and I could tell that he put a lot of work into it. He told me he was renovating the whole building and that the construction noise would only be temporary. We talked some more and discussed the price, and I ended up taking the deal. Later in the week, I moved in and set everything up. Every time I saw the outside of the building, I couldn't believe I was living in a place that looked like that, but I just had to remind myself that it was the inside that counted. 3 weeks went by without problems or concerns about the place until I started to realize something suspicious. I observed that nobody else seemed to live in the building. I never saw anyone parked outside or walking inside, and I never heard anyone through the thin walls. Additionally, I never heard any construction going on like the owner had said there would be. I kept these thoughts in the back of my mind until one morning when leaving for work, I saw one of the other room's doors was partially open. I walked past it and went about my day, but when I got back later that night, it was still open. After some thought, I figured it had to be vacant. I pushed it more open. Inside, the room was dusty and smelled awful. There were webs and stains all over the walls. I went to my apartment, but before I walked in, I became curious about the other apartments. I knocked on my neighboring apartment door, and nobody answered. I turned the handle, and it was unlocked. I pushed open the door, and the room was the same as the other one, looking to have been abandoned for years. But the apartment next to mine didn't seem to be abandoned. Or at least I could see that the lights were turned on from under the door in that apartment. This, of course, made me even more curious, since none of the other apartments had seen human life in what seemed to be years. As I opened its door, I saw a very minimal setup inside it. The room was all clean and only had a couch, a chair, and a small table. I kept looking around the room and noticed that the wall that was facing up against my apartment had small holes in it. It was as if someone was spying on me from that room. As I stood there, I heard footsteps outside and they began to get closer, and as I heard that the apartment door opened, I quickly closed the door of the room in which I was standing. I held my ear on the door and heard, whoever it was, he was getting closer. I don't know what he was doing, but I stood there and listened through the door for around 30 minutes until I heard something. He twisted the doorknob to the room I was standing in, but I had it locked from the inside. I was so scared that I thought of calling the police, but since I wasn't in my own apartment, I had technically broken into another home. I then decided to call the owner. As I called his phone number, I heard his phone ringing just outside the door. Just moments after that ring, I heard his footsteps going away and eventually fading. After standing there for 5 minutes, to make sure I was alone, I walked out of the apartment and entered my own. As I got inside my apartment, the owner was just standing there. I remember confronting him and asking what was going on. He didn't respond. I asked him about the apartment next door. As I mentioned it, he didn't really know what to say. He refused to know anything about it. Then I pointed towards the holes in the wall and asked what it was about. He said he didn't know what it was, and he would get a handyman out and fix it. After he left, I started packing up everything, and the next day I left and never looked back. I never saw that man again, and I never went back to Craigslist for anything.